morning.
Today we're going to be in Romans chapter 13. I'll just turn this way since we're all over here. But as you're turning there and before we read it, a little bit so that I can speak this morning. Last Sunday night, I asked, I think somewhat forcefully, that we begin to work on our culture of lateness. And then this morning, I was a good 15, maybe even 20 minutes late. So let me start by saying, while I could excuse it, I was wrong. I should have managed time better and just bit the bullet. So I apologize for asking and then totally botching it. My bad. And I'm just going to own it. I was late and I could excuse it, but I'll just own it. It's a lot better. And I was clearly late. I was at least 15 and probably pushing the 20-minute mark, if not a little more than that. So my fault. And with that being said, I think I have also given you in the apology time to get to Romans 13. As we talk through our government discussion over the next several weeks, Romans 13 is one of those passages that any discussion of how the Bible talks to Christians in interacting with government and how government works is going to come up. It is almost the staple main text for this topic. So there is plenty of places if you want to leg some of these things out further or see in some of the different ways. There is not a lack of material out there for this passage. One of the things, and I don't know if I have shared this resource, so I'll just share a resource as well. There's a website called Precept Austin. I don't know why it's Austin. I doubt it's named after our Austin, but whatever. And I can't remember if it's a .org or a .com. It could go either. It might even be a .net. I get confused. But if you just Google Precept Austin and you put in whatever Bible passage that you want to maybe get a little more in depth with, it will pull up a smorgasbord of different resources that connect back to that. But you'll have to treat it like a watermelon because it will pull from several different traditions. And it will pull from varying viewpoints, not all of which are correct. It's just a gatherer of material. And now that I think about it, I don't know that I've used the watermelon analogy here. So when you eat a watermelon, you eat the good stuff, you spit out the seeds, and you stay away from the rind. You'll have to treat that website with that way. And for that matter, that's how you should just treat information. Because there's always a little bit of a seed in all of the goodness. And with that being stated, the first 7 verses of chapter 13 of the book of Romans. Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what's good, and you'll have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due them. Tax to whom tax is due. Custom to whom custom. Fear to whom fear. Honor to whom honor. Father God, we thank you that you are the sovereign one, and that ultimately you are where our allegiance falls. But God, help us to recognize that we represent our allegiance to you in everything that we do. So help us to be good citizens as far as we can of this country, not because of some eccentricity or just some ego or something along those lines, but so that we could bring glory to your kingdom. Ultimately, God, help us to bring everything back to you. Help us to bring everything back in our mindsets and how we function as being about how we operate with you. Help us to represent you well in a culture that clearly needs good representatives of you. Help us to be those ambassadors who would carry your word and your ideology and your character to the people who do not know it and clearly need to know it. And in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Now, as a little bit of an introduction to, because we're hopping in clearly chapter 13 of the book of Romans, there are 12 chapters that come before it, and while I would like to do that, here's the real quick summary. That's like at least 12 sermons in and of itself, so that's out of the question. But Paul has a typical way in which he will write his letters. Romans is kind of in that same ballpark, a little less clearly divided sometimes, but he will normally start with the theology on the front end of his letters and then get into practical, how this works in your life application on the back end of his letters. Normally it's about a half and half division, but that's normally and roughly. I don't think he sat down and said, okay, I've got 28 verses here, I'll put 28 verses here. But as a general rule, and in Romans it kind of follows that same, and we're on the practical end of living. So the weightier, well, that's probably not how I want to phrase that, but the more theological, abstract versions or verses have kind of been in the front end of this book. I'm not sure why versions was the word that came to my head instead of verses. But anyway, sorry about that. But in the process, Paul is now getting to the how do you live out the gospel. Paul is writing to, Romans is the one letter that he writes to an audience that he's not familiar with. That's why you'll get some of the extra details in Romans that you don't get elsewhere. Most of the people, scholarship-wise, that are looking at this book, think that it is probably a go before him introductory letter. He is planning on going to Rome, even on either on his power or under being arrested and going to see the emperor. One of the things that as a Roman citizen you could do was evoke your right to have your case heard by the emperor himself, by Caesar, which sometimes was a good idea. Most of the time probably would not have been, because they're nuts. And they could go, if you're having this discussion of if you should pay $5 or not, and you go before the emperor, he may very well say, oh, you don't know $5, we'll just cut your head off. It was that kind of whimsy that they had. And we're going to talk about who the emperor was here in just a second, because that's actually really important to this text, because it's Nero, who is really nuts. But we'll kind of come back to him in a second. But in general, this is how one should live practically. This is boots on the ground, theology put into practice. This is that kind of weighty application. How we go in everyday, not just pie in the sky, but this was in that letter to people he hasn't met. He's gone through the introduction of the great intricacy of the gospel. That's why the front end of Romans, being a letter of kind of introduction and to make sure they're on the same page to see if the Christians in Rome are actually going to greet him or if he's starting from scratch when he gets there. But when he gets there, here is the go before letter. Here's who I am, what I believe, what the gospel is. It's a really nice philosophy of ministry kind of thing, I guess. A little introductory letter. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. But anyway, that's what he's got. So here, this is being written to the Christians in Rome, which is not the safest place to be a Christian. They've had Claudius. They've had Caligula. Caligula, by the way, if you'll remember, is the guy who appoints his horse as a senator. So he's clearly on the level. And there's some debate about if he was raving mad or really a genius. Um, and you know, like when you look at him appointing his horse, you can clearly see where the raving mad comes from. But the catch is that some want to give him the benefit of a doubt and say that he's making a statement of his horse could run the country as good as a senator could. Which, you know, maybe we should elect a horse as president. I don't know. Just joking. That's actually a really bad context for where we're going. But you know, that's who has been. There's been a lot of persecution to Christians, and now the emperor is Nero. So it's all rosy now, right? No. Nero has kind of this warped sense of humor and thinks that if Christians want to be the light of the world, then they should start at his dinner parties as the light. And he is actually kind of notoriously known for burning people alive during his parties. And Christians are his favorite. He is one warped little dude. And we're just going to leave it at, no matter how bad you think your political leaders are, they are not Nero bad. They are not anywhere near Nero bad. There is a large gulf of difference. No matter how corrupt you think our system is, it is nowhere near as corrupt as Rome was. In Roman court, you know, here when we talk about judges being bribed and senators being bribed, you know, it's kind of this under the table, they're trying to be stealthy about it, you know, and they call it different things, and, you know, and it's kind of hidden, and then it gets brought out to light because all of those things which are hidden eventually see the light of day. There's a verse in Timothy about that. But in this particular case, in Rome, why are we going to bother to hide it? They hide it about as well as Thurston Howe does in Gilligan's Island. Oh, you seem to have dropped this $500. It's right there. Oh, you dropped it. You know, like it's that sort of thing. They just don't even bother to hide it. As a matter of fact, it almost works in this comical sense, and I'm exaggerating, but just a tad, of walk into court and the judge would just say, okay, so what your case is how much are you going to bribe me with? How much are you going to bribe me with? You win. That's essentially how this works. If you are not from that city, you lose. Just period. So if you are a stranger, if you are somebody who is, you know, if you went from here to even my hometown in Bristol, and you were in a court case and this was Rome, you would lose. And if the Bristolian came here, he would lose. I don't know if that's a real word, we're just going to act like it. But in the course of things, that's Rome. Rome is as corrupt at this point as she can be. And again, there's a huge gulf between the corruptions. We're going that way, and we're going pedal down that way. But there were a lot of other things that Rome also was very corrupt with. They are a gangrene society at this point, and if we're not careful... But I say all of that, A, as a warning, but also so that we will remember when Paul says, be subject to your government, he's not living in utopia. He's not living in colonial American, where, you know, everybody believed or at least was friendly to the gospel. He's not living in the ideal spot. He is actually in prison when he writes this, likely. There's some debate about that, and since I haven't had coffee with him yet to ask him, I'll have to let you know later. Or you can ask him yourself, depending on which one of us gets there first. But in the process, when he makes the comment, be in subjection to government, he's not got some great theocracy that's ruling over him. Not in the theocracy that we think of it, a government ruled by God. He is, I guess in one sense, because they do worship Caesar. They do worship Nero. But some of that is out of fear, and not the reverent fear that this passage ends with, but just fear. I mean, he's the guy that'll kill you just because it's fun. He burned half of Rome so he could rebuild it in the way he wanted it. And while I doubt he played the fiddle, since the fiddle was not invented when it happened, but it's pretty well documented that Nero was the culprit of the fire. That burns it down so he can rebuild it with his palace in the center and in a grand sort of way. that he then blames on Christians. So keep all of this in mind. This is the government that Paul is telling people you need to be subject to. You need to be good citizens to. So when this comes up in our discussion and we have that tendency in us to go, oh, but wait. No. But wait. You're not in Rome. And while there is a spot for, like the story in Daniel chapter 3 of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there is a place in which when the two citizenships that you have to your country and to your God's kingdom come in conflict, yes, go with your God's kingdom. Go with Yahweh. It's a good spot to go. Most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, it is not a moral bellyache that we have. Most of the time, it's a we don't like your ideology. Most of the time, it is not really in that same camp. But there is a place for that, and I get that. And Paul is not denying that in this passage. What he is getting at is the notion of government as a whole. What he is getting at is that we are to be under subjection to those who are placed above us. There is an order. We mentioned this last week. That, that's going to bother me. I'm going to sneeze and not sneeze all at the same time. Sorry. But in the process, God is a God of order, and he creates things so that there will be order. And that includes from family to the church. So things that are just in chaos are normally not being ran the way God intends them to. That also includes government. God has established government so that his word can go out further. There is a lot of good that comes from government. There's a lot of evil sometimes, I get that, and we could make that case from other places, but understand that God is sovereign in history, and that includes setting up kingdoms, setting up governments. So we're to be subjection to the government. That's the same word that shows up when it talks in marital relationships. It's a military term. It's what you would say to, the captain has to be in subjection to his general, or the private to the captain. It's not a statement of worth. It is a statement of loyalty. It's a statement and an order. It has more to do with order than worth by every stretch of the imagination. It doesn't downplay here any more than it downplays in a household. This is the notion of, for the sake of order, for the sake of things being able to move forward, place yourself in subjection. Why? Because there is no authority except from God. Every authority that somebody on earth has, it's because God allows them to have it. Even when Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate says, don't you understand? I can let you go or I can kill you. Jesus says, only because I let you. He actually says only because the Father lets you, but you get my point. And here, and those which exist are established by God. So because God has put them where he has put them, he has put them there with purpose. We know this about our God. God isn't whimsical. He's not, let's just kind of fill in here. Sometimes when I'm planting flowers, as a horticulturalist, because I like saying that word now, there are sometimes that I just am like, there's a gap here. There's this little empty spot. So I just shove something in there that I can find on the cheap that kind of matches. That's not God. God doesn't just go, I need to fill in some space, so I'll just throw something in here. He's intentional about what he puts there. There's a long-term plan that he's thinking through that has to work out, because he's working it out as the sovereign creator of the universe. So therefore, if we are obedient to that government, and yes, I understand again, there are those times in which we have to go, but that's against what God says, and then we rebel. The speed limit, not one of those. Paying our taxes, not one of those. And we can think of various examples that we dislike. I dislike sometimes that because I live in the city, I can't have a fire pit in the backyard. Granted, that's hard in an apartment anyways, but, there are those notions. I dislike sometimes on the 4th of July that I can't blow stuff up in my own yard. That I have to come to Independence to blow stuff up. But it's okay, because I like you all, and I normally spend time with you all in blowing stuff up. So there's some of those things that, is it a moral thing? Should I go, oh, but I'm a Christian, I should get to shoot off fireworks? What? There's not a verse for that. The verse for that is, I'm supposed to be subject to government. So if the government says, we don't want you to blow stuff up here, I don't blow stuff up there. Clearly we're talking about in fireworks, not just blowing stuff up. In case that needs to be, though they frown upon just blowing stuff up in general too, now that I think about it. So either way. But here, what we're getting with is that there is an intentionality that God has established those governments. That includes bad government. That included Nero. That includes whoever wins in November. That includes whoever won the last several cycles. I mean, that's, you go back through from Washington to Obama, they were all ordained by God to be in the slot that they are. Now, please don't take the fatalist view of that and say, well, then I'm just going to stay home and whatever. You have responsibility. I cannot stress that more. I encourage you to vote. You decide who you're going to vote for, but do it. That's about the only advice I have on that. Therefore, verse 2, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. So this is the notion of when I just get it in my craw to do that which is against the law, that which is against authority, even if it's, well, I can figure out the loophole in that, doesn't matter. The point is when I choose to disregard that which is legitimate authority above me, then I'm disregarding my Lord. So just remember that the next time you decide to speed. And I use speeding because, I have a tendency. Not as much as I did when I was younger, but I still do. There are certain things that we do that when we rebel against government, and we do, then that's what we're rebelling against. We're rebelling against that which God has established. It is much the same as when your child rebels against you. When your children say, nope, I'm not going to do what you want to do, they are, yes, rebelling against you, but ultimately you were placed as the authority to them by God. Ultimately, they're rebelling against God. And how you handle that demonstrates how God handles that to your children. But that's another sermon, and we'll come back to that because it's actually quite important. But the notion here is verse 2 is the why, the therefore, the because. Because we don't want to oppose God. We don't want to fly in the face of what God has established. Then we need to behave. One of the things that should mark out Christians as we live, and as we look at this in the text that's coming, we should be the most well-behaved people. We should be like Daniel when it is chapter 6 in the lion's den. Just in case I get the chapter wrong, I'm pretty sure I'm right, but at the same time, let me hedge my bets. When it is the rest of the authorities hate him, they want him gone and done away with, what do? Well, they watch him for a while, and they're going to get him on something, but he doesn't ever do anything wrong. He follows the rules. He follows the system. And his king at that time isn't really all that grand in the sense of like we would go, oh, there's a great moral leader. There's a shining example of what utopia could look like for us. Again, he's a pagan. But because he is well behaved, and I don't mean that to be in any kind of like trivial childish sense, but because he is a well behaved, well mannered, moral person, I mean, he has an 80-year stretch of working in government and staying uncorrupted. I mean, he's a really great example of what we should be. But at the end of it, they have to change the rules so that he has to choose between, do I serve Darius, or do I serve Yahweh? Well, sorry, Darius, I like you, but you lose. And that's the way in which this works. They have to change the playing field so that he has to choose. Well, most of us don't ever get to that point. When people want to take us down, they don't have to work that hard. But that should be true of Christians. It should be so true of us that we are lawful, good people, in that sense of good, that when somebody wants to speak ill of us, people go, you're an idiot. That person? Really? No. I bet they don't even speed. And again, I use speeding for a reason. And, I bet that they don't, I bet they follow every rule. That it's just inconceivable for them to think that you do something wrong. Not because you're a goody two-shoe, not because you're a prude. These things are all different in their aim, but because you're just good. And if you follow Christ, then part of what you are following is the command in Peter to live peaceably with all men as much as it depends upon you. Because I get it, and you get it, and Peter got it, that some people will not live peacefully with you. They just won't. No matter how good you are to them, they will make your life miserable. It's their goal. They're mean, hateful people. So they live mean, hateful lives. But for the rest of this text, notice that there is this push to, you should be good for goodness sake. Not because Santa Claus is coming, now that I say it that way. I hadn't phrased it quite that way in my head before. But because it's what is right. You should be law-abiding and follow government as far as you can, as well as you can, as long as it doesn't conflict with Christianity, for several good reasons. First, because God established it. Second, and they who oppose it will receive condemnation upon themselves. There is a punishment for not following the rules. Just like when my children disobey me, they get in trouble. When my daughter decides that she's going to just throw a big fit, and she's going to kick, and I know that she's perfect and wonderful. We're just making an example. When she decides that she's just going to slap my hand because she doesn't want me to pick her up and she wants to run up and down the stairs, there's a consequence for that. She gets in trouble for it. My son, whenever he disobeys, there's a consequence for that. And he's learned it. And she's learning it. She's one, we give her a little grace. Or at least I do. But in the process, there is a consequence. So we should also be good because there's a consequence when we're not. And one of those consequences, for it's a minister of God to you for good. Government is put there, even when it's hard for us to see, for our good, for our benefit. You can think if we lived in an anarchy, if there just wasn't any government, somebody would still step up and be in charge. There would just be no recourse. Government is there for order. Because we live in an ordered society, and we may disagree with how ordered it is sometimes, I get that. But in the process, if we live in an ordered society, then there is certain advancements that we can get. Health, for instance, is a whole lot better off now than it was in the caveman days. Not that I actually think of cavemen, but back before when even colonial America, you have a blood disease, we'll just put a leech on you. That'll take care of it. Or we'll just bleed you. We'll just cut you and let you bleed, and that'll let all the sickness out of you. Yeah, it'll also let all the blood out of you. I don't quite understand. Why is this a good idea? Or other, like, you have headaches. We'll drill into your skull. No, let's not do that. I'll keep my headache. Thanks. But this is how an ordered, peaceful society allows medicine to progress. A peaceful, ordered society allows technology to progress. When you grow a garden, you don't have to go out with your oxen and hitch up the plow to it to now plow it. Big enough, a tractor, and you can plow it up that way. When we come inside on a hot day, it's nice. We can go to the refrigerator, or the ice box, as my grandfather calls it, and you can get something cold out of there. You can then sit down and cool down in your air-conditioned house. Or if it's the winter, you can warm something up in the microwave and sit in your heated house. That's something that didn't exist not too long ago. Indoor plumbing exists because of an orderly society, and I like it. Let me just throw that out there in case you were wondering where I stand. But in the process, it's a minister for good. Government is there to bring order, to bring a certain bit of expectation. As long as we know what's coming, we can progress and we can plan and we can put plans into action. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister. It has a role. And part of government's role is to punish those people who do things which are bad. You can imagine how much actual time is taken up by court stuff of when somebody does something wrong. And now imagine if that's now done on your time, and you have to right your own wrongs, and you have to avenge yourself all the time. Well, congratulations, you're not going to work. But because there's an ordered society that punishes people who step outside of that order, you don't have to go form a posse and go track down people. We have people that do that. And it's government. That's part of why you should pray for your police. Pray for all of the bureaus of. Because if I start trying to figure out all of them, I get confused. That's what our government is there is, yes, to set order and to maintain order. Order is something that God always builds into whatever He builds. It's intended to have order. And there's a benefit from that order. And when you step out of that order, there's a benefit. When you speed, you get a ticket. When you get a ticket, your insurance goes up. Don't speed. Obey the order. If you decide, I'm going to go over here and I'm mad at my neighbor, so I'm going to set their house on fire, don't. But there's a recompense for that. There's a consequence. There's something that you're going to get in trouble for. If you decide, well, I'm just not going to pay my taxes, there's trouble for that. And here, and I intentionally bring this to a point, it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a foregone conclusion here in this passage that government has the right for capital punishment. And that right comes from the same place its authority does. And sometimes we have this discussion in Christian circles of, can we support the death penalty? When rightly applied, yes, because it's there. Now, I'm kind of on that same boat as we think going back, if you are going 60 in a 55 zone, probably not the place in which we should be applying the death penalty. Okay? Maybe we shouldn't have the cop just pull you out and, there you go. Yes, I get it. There's a limit, there's a point, and but Paul's not talking the technicality here. He's reminding his people that especially the society that he lived in, that was the kind of stuff that you could expect, though. The government had the right to punish people for getting out of line, and it was harsh. They didn't have minor offenses most of the time. You can imagine if you owed somebody $5, you went to jail. That's a problem. If you couldn't pay it, that's a problem. Because you're clearly not going to earn money while you're in prison. You can clearly imagine how that's going to affect the rest of it. But this is the notion is that as long as you're being good, you don't have to fear the punishments of government. If I don't speed, I don't have to worry when I see the flashing lights coming up behind me, because he's not or she, they're not coming for me. But if I've just been going 55 in the 25 zone, I have cause to worry. I don't do that, by the way, not even when I'm speeding, because that's just excessive. And normally 25 in the school zone, I frown on that. God loves children, I'm sure of it. But he is the avenger, meaning that he is government, he is the one who will right those wrongs. Because God has given them the authority and the place to do it. Do sometimes they abuse that role? Yes, I get it. But what we're talking about here is the concept and the construct, the general rules. most of the time, when we bellyache about, it's not the moral end of things again. But then, verse 5, therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, not only because there's a punishment, but because of conscience, because it's the right thing to do. And there is, when we raise children, there are two types of motivation. There's also two types of motivation when you go to work for you to follow the rules. There's the fear of being fired or the fear of punishment. And then there's this is what I should be doing, an external and an intrinsic motivation. And what Paul is getting at here is that sometimes those two things work in tandem. And at my work, these things work in tandem. If I decide that I just want to go sleep under the shade tree, I could probably get away with it for a while. Certain things die when you don't water them, and then it gets noticeable. But in the process, there should be a bell that goes off in my head of, if I go, I'm going to get fired. The first time my boss walks into the office and my feet are kicked up on the desk and I am just snoring away, I'm probably going to get in trouble for that. The second and third time, I'm probably going home for that, and just with all my stuff. So there's that. But then there's also should be that part in us, and that I think as you mature should be the predominant part that says, no, this is the right thing to do. I'm getting paid for a job. I'm going to go do the job. I teach my son, yes, if you are a bad boy, you get a consequence. Bad boys get consequences, good boys get privilege. But there comes a point, and I think that he's now kind of figured it out, that it's not about the punishment, and it's about the character. And there's just a certain, no, this is what I know to be right, so I'm going to do it. And what Paul is getting at is that notion. There is a point in which you go from fearing punishment to, this is just simply right, I'm going to do it. And being a good citizen, following the law, and doing those things which we can, is that. It allows us, when we go home at night, to lay down and go to sleep. You can imagine if you have, 3 warrants out for your arrest. I don't know how you sleep. Because you're always got to, every knock on your door has to be that trigger of, wait, is the cop here for me? Everything, is it every time that you walk through somewhere where you have to show your ID, is this the time I'm going to get busted? You live in this fear world that cannot let your conscience be at ease. That's what Paul is getting at. There is a place and there is a point in which you obey because you don't want to get in trouble. But more importantly, you want to obey because it's the right thing to do. 1 Peter says it this way in talking with family relations, children, obey your parents, for this is right. It doesn't say because they're going to beat you senseless. It doesn't say because there's a reward for doing it, because it's right. It's the correct thing to do. We should obey government because it's right, because it's the correct thing to do. But also, verse 6, for because of this, you also pay taxes. Now this is one of those where sometimes I go, how'd you make that? Wait, how did we go to there? How did we all of a sudden jump over here to paying of taxes? Because I don't like this verse. Just joking. I get it. But then you think about, and if it's about order, well, they've got to function somehow. If there is somebody who has a job, there is something that they then get a wage for. And they can either get it by producing fines, which we all know how that's going to go, or there is a tax that supports that being maintained. Because it's God ordained, because it's there for your good, because it's there to watch over you and allow you to live in order so that you can be Christian, so that you can do what Christians do in safety, or at least relative safety. It's a lot easier for us to do evangelism here than, say, if you went down to Mexico, or you went to, because I was hearing another one of those stories where, this town is now controlled by the bad guys, or at least in the telling of the way in which the article was written. Or, if you go over here to somewhere like Afghanistan, where in the back, the government's not really in control of this town, and it's kind of ran by, whoever happens to be the potentate at the time. I don't know the real word, so we'll use potentate. It's a lot harder because there's a lot more whimsy. There's a lot more of chaos, and I don't know what's coming next, so I don't know where to go from here. It's the same thing that drove Isaiah at the beginning of chapter 6, and we sometimes hurry to get to the back end of that. But in the year King Uzziah died, well, he's going from, I see order, and now I'm looking at chaos because the government is in shambles. That's what drives him to pray. That's what Paul is remembering here is that government that you are supporting with your taxes, because that's what it should be. That's the way in which we have the construct set up, and we may not like how that's used. I get that. That's part of the sermon. Is though that I still pay it. I have met Christians, and I meet them in ever increasing abundance who are like, well, I didn't vote for him, so I'm not going to pay my taxes. Okay, but you didn't vote for the judge either, you didn't vote for the guy who's going to come and collect from your bank account, or the guy who could possibly put you in jail either. So the notion here is that there is, to those to whom it's due, you should pay. That's part of also what verse 7, render to all what is due them. Now it doesn't say anything beyond this, but it says what is due them, what is proper, what is good, what is just, so that it can continue. Tax to whom tax is due. Tax is what you give essentially to government. It's the most generic of the words that's used here. Then custom, to whom custom is. So this is to distinguish the terms a little bit. And it's a little less black and white. It's a little more gray than I'm going to make it, but for the sake of clarity. You have taxes, which is what you're paying to Rome. You have taxes, which is what you're paying to use our vernacular, the federal government. Big brother, if you will. And then your customs is what you're paying to... that's what Matthew, as a tax collector, was actually collecting. He was collecting the customs. What you would... your sales tax, that kind of thing. That's essentially the difference. Now I've pushed them apart a little bit, and there's a fuzzier line there than I just made it. But essentially, those are the different. So that pretty much covers all of those things, both your federal and your local taxes. You don't get to, well, I paid the other guy. It'd be nice if we could just say, well, I'll pay one or the other, but it doesn't work that way. Because both the state and the local and the federal need to maintain order. And thus, maybe they could steward the money better, but that's a different story and a different audience that I should talk to about that, because you're not stewarding their money. At least I don't think you are. If you are, we should talk. But also then, fear to whom fear. Now, interesting, this does have kind of that reverence, but it's not the full-on worship. He's not saying worship to whom worship is due. As a matter of fact, this is what gets the Jews kicked out of Rome. Christians can be in Rome, but at this point when this is written, I'm not sure that there are, I think this is past that point, but there was an edict that expelled all of the Jews out of Rome because they were troublemakers. So we'll just kick them out of the capital. And then you will have no ability to influence policy. What's the thought? We'll just kick you out. And we'll silence you that way. And that's part of the diaspora that is written of in James, but that's more of a spiritual thing. But in this notion, it is fear to whom fear is due. Reverence to whom reverence is supposed to be given. Growing up, I had trouble with a particular teacher. Only one, as best I can remember, who, this lady was just horrible. And she was very manipulative, and she probably should have retired about 20 years before I had her. She was a math teacher that I had, and I'm just going to refrain from using her name so that I can give reverence to whom reverence should be due. And I struggled with this lady, and my dad, I could tell, was kind of struggling because he would get phone calls or emails. And finally one day I just sat down, I've had it, I'm just going to let her know what I think. Which was problematic because I was also the kid who was clearly the Christian kid. And I was about the only person in the class when I had her that hadn't just let her know what I thought of her. And Dad said, you can't do that. She's the teacher. She's wrong, but she's the teacher. I was like, Dad, I don't think you understand. He goes, no, really. Let me slow your roll a little bit, son. I don't think that was the exact quote, but that was the intention of, she is the teacher and she is the authority. And while you and I may think she's wrong, she's got to control the class and she's got to maintain order. And she has a job to do. And I want you to respect at least the fact that she is the position of teacher, even if you can't respect her. And I had to bow to his logic. I had to bow to the fact that there is a certain bit of, okay, I need to give my authority grace even when she is utterly wrong. And it was a lesson that then has applied to other places, because there are certain times in which I've had a boss that I just look at and go, if you weren't the boss, I would tell you that you're an idiot. And you just have to sometimes bite your tongue, because there's I will respect the position even if I cannot respect you. That's the notion here. And honor to whom honor is due. Sometimes that's more because of position. Sometimes that is simply, you're the authority, so I'm going to have to just grin and bear it. There was a particular church that I worked at for a while that I left because I realized the pastor and I, as I was the youth kid, or the youth pastor, not kid in the sense of in it, that because we differ and because I'm not going to be, I need to either leave or shift how I think, and I just couldn't make the swing over. So I moved. And it was awkward, but it's how that works. We have to give heed to, as long as they're not being amoral. Like if the pastor had actually done something like say, see, this verse says what you're doing is wrong, then I would have gone that route. But it was a difference of just how we thought about things and how we executed things. And therefore, if I can't give him honor, then I need to find a different authority to be under. Or I need to change my attitude. And now that I'm a little bit older and a little bit, I hope, wiser, and I reflect back, I probably should have started with my attitude a whole lot differently. But that's the point of this passage is that we need to give honor and respect to those who are our governmental officials. And again, we sometimes come back with, but you don't know how bad they are. You're right, I don't know how bad they are. I mean, I see that they're bad. I mean, we can clearly, you don't have to be more than 5 to realize, really. It's not rocket science, but you don't know how bad they actually are even. I bet it's worse than you even think. But at the end of the day, they're still not Nero bad. Mm-hmm. They're still not Caligula, Little Boots bad. I mean, they're still not at the whim of a hat, like the Mad Hatter or the Queen of Hearts from Alice, off with their head. That's, you ran out, you backed into your neighbor's car, off with your head. We're not there. Correct? Sure, probably. I don't know that. I haven't done the investigation. But you wouldn't have to press me hard for me to go, okay, we've got corruption. We've got some. You wouldn't have to press me hard there. But at the end of the day, I still have to give them respect. I still have to give them honor because God has placed them there. Now, on the flip side of that, we should be praying for them because God has placed them there. For those who are in leadership, there is always more accountability. There is always more expectation. Nebuchadnezzar, for instance, since we're using Daniel as the positive, let me use him as the negative. He gets struck with madness, where he goes out and he eats in the field like he's a cow or an ox or something along those lines. He grows his hair out because he's nuts. He thinks he's an animal. It's a really bizarre picture when you think, 1 minute he's in the throne room and then he's like, oh, look how great I am. And then he's mad. He's just nuts, and he's out, and until he has this realization of, nope, God is the one who is awesome. And then he gets his mind back, and he cleans up, and he goes back to ruling for a while. It's this bizarre, that happens, because God is the one who is sovereign. And at the end of the day, God is working out a plan through governments, even if it's hard for us to imagine how God could use that to get us to the kingdom. That's the plan He's working out. And government is for our benefit. And therefore, because God has established it in order to give us order so that we can better build His kingdom, we need to do all that we can in being subjected to it. We need to bring ourselves under it so that we don't get brought under it as much as we can. I understand that there are those times and those places in which we go, the Bible says, and you say, I'm going with the Bible. I get it. I encourage you to do that, okay? Shall we serve God or shall we serve you? I think somebody really smart, a.k.a. Peter, said that once to his authority. So it's biblical. You can rebel when what you're supposed to do isn't biblical. But we need to be more like Daniel. I think we could be a lot more good for goodness sake than we are. I think that we can do a lot better job of coming under, and instead of slandering or instead of gossiping about our leaders, and praying for them. I think that this would, if we really believe in the sovereignty of God anyways, which we should, by the way, that's a box that you should check. And as we believe that if God is the sovereign one, and if the heart of, as Proverbs says, the heart of the king is as waters or channels of water in the hands of God, then maybe that should be the source that we go to for actual change. And that's what Paul is getting at. Paul loses his head to Nero at the end of the day. Essentially when he goes and pleads his case in front of Nero, Nero says, oh, you're a Christian, well, off with your head. And according to church history anyways, he is beheaded because he is bold enough to take his case and give the gospel to Caesar, to Nero, who you kind of know going into it that you're going to lose that discussion. But Paul does it anyways. When Paul goes to talk about the wrongs, he doesn't list out all of the social injustices that people need to change so that it's in a utopia. Instead, he says, here's the gospel, let's pray for those in charge that they get that. That's where we need to fall as a congregation. And we're going to reiterate that every time that we do one of these studies. Ultimately, it is not government that's going to fix our wrong. Will government make life better? Yes. Does it have the possibility of making life worse? Absolutely. But ultimately, it is the gospel and it is God who fixes America. It is the gospel and it is God who fixes the world. Amen. Jesus didn't die so that we could have better government. Jesus died so that we would be better governed. So that we would be reconciled with Christ. And part of the overflow of that, according to Romans and Paul here, is that we would be good citizens. So that way, people would have less to accuse us with. So that there would be less smear on the name of God. So that when people think of us, they think of honorable, mature, dignified people who can be trusted and thus listened to. That's what this, in its larger context, because again, I haven't figured out how to do an overview well and it be fast. But that's what this section in Romans is getting at, is how we behave brings us an audience. How we behave with our government brings us an audience with them. How we behave with our family brings us an audience with them. How we behave with our neighbors brings us an audience with them. Our being under subjection is not a lessening of us. It's an exaltation of our kingdom. It's an exaltation of, here's how good the gospel is. That's ultimately Paul's driving point in the practical section, is that everything you do brings you back to who is God. Ultimately, it reflects back on, is God sovereign in your view? And if we worry to the point where we just and everything is this, oh, it's the end of the world for us, then it reflects that our God is not as sovereign as we say He is. And that's a problem. So during this election, yes, vote. Yes, pay attention. Yes, be informed. Be intelligent. Don't go bury your head in the sand like an ostrich theoretically does. They're looking for food when they do that. They're not hiding. Not that that matters. But at the same time, don't be disengaged, but just realize that ultimately our hope comes down to Christ, just like it does in everything else. Let's pray. Father God, I think